It's a beautiful stitch, Mama. Really? But don't you think it's time to maybe move on from the crochet? It's a bit dated for the new living room. I looked at my daughter, Simone, then at the ivory-weighted shawl resting across my lap. I didn't stop my hands. The silver hook clicked softly against the yarn, a steady, rhythmic pulse. Dated, I repeated. My voice was like a low hum, smooth as polished mahogany. Funny word for something that keeps you warm. Her husband, Gerald, leaned against the doorframe of my sunroom. He didn't enter. He never quite stepped all the way into my space. He just hovered, like a shadow waiting for the sun to move. He checked his watch, a heavy, gold-plated thing that looked too large for his wrist. What Simone means, Gerald intervened, his smile not reaching his eyes, is that we're looking toward the future. Minimalist, clean lines. We're thinking of clearing out the garage this weekend. 2. That old grandfather clock. It's taking up space where the treadmill should go. I let a stitch slip. Just one. That clock belonged to your father. Simone, I said, my gaze shifting to her. She looked away first. I know, Mama, but it hasn't ticked in years. It's just heavy. Everything in this house feels so heavy lately. I watched them exchange a look, that fleeting, arrogant glance shared by people who think they are the only ones in the room with a plan. They thought I was a relic, a soft-edged woman buried in wool and memories. They didn't realize that when you spend 40 years watching the tension of a thread, you learn exactly how much pressure it takes to snap it. They left the room then, their footsteps loud and hurried. I waited until the sound of Gerald's SUV faded down the driveway before I stood up. My knees didn't creak. I moved with the practiced silence of someone who has spent a lifetime being overlooked. I walked to the garage. It was cooler here, smelling of cedar and oil. The grandfather clock stood in the corner, shrouded in a heavy moving blanket. My husband had spent his final years out here, tinkering with its inner workings. Simone thought it was broken. Gerald thought it was junk. I pulled back the blanket. The mahogany casing was flawless. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small brass key. I didn't wind the face of the clock. Instead, I knelt and inserted the key into a tiny, nearly invisible grommet near the base, the third leaf of the carved ivy. With a soft snick, a shallow drawer slid open. Inside were not jewels or gold. There were ledgers, dozens of them, and a stack of envelopes addressed to a law firm downtown that Gerald had been visiting far too often lately. My husband wasn't just a watchmaker. He was a man who understood that time is the ultimate currency, and he had left me the bank. I picked up the top ledger. In it, in Gerald's distinctive, aggressive handwriting, were the restructuring plans for this house, my house. He wasn't just planning for a treadmill. He was planning for a sale. He had already listed the property as part of his assets for a bridge loan he'd taken out in secret. He thought I was the crochet. Something soft, something dated, something easily folded and put away in a dark box. I ran my fingers over the cold brass of the clock's pendulum. It was still. For now, Gerald wanted to talk about the future. He wanted clean lines and empty spaces. He didn't realize that I had been keeping the books long before he learned how to read a balance sheet. He didn't realize that my husband hadn't left me a broken clock. He had left me a countdown. I closed the drawer and replaced the blanket, smoothing it down with a gentle, motherly touch. The disrespect had been a slow leak, but the betrayal, that was a flood. And the thing about floods is that they don't care how expensive your shoes are. I walked back into the kitchen and put the kettle on. The whistle would blow soon. Everything has its timing. I had a quilt to finish for Gerald. A special one where every knot was a secret and every pattern was a trap he was already walking into. I sat back down, the silver hook catching the light. Everything feels heavy, Simone. I whispered to the empty kitchen. Just wait. We haven't even reached the gravity of the situation yet. The clock doesn't just keep time, it keeps secrets. And Gerald is about to find out that some debts are paid in seconds, not dollars. If you want to see how a mother's silence turns into a masterpiece of justice, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the moment the pendulum finally swings. Like this video if you believe wisdom always outruns arrogance, and comment below, do you think Simone is truly in the dark, or is she part of the plan? Share this story with someone who appreciates a dish best served cold and quiet. The following morning, the house smelled of rosemary and floor wax, a scent that usually signals a fresh start. But as I sat by the window, the light catching the fine gray hairs on my knuckles, the air felt thick with a different kind of anticipation. I was working on the border of Gerald's quilt. It was a deep midnight blue, the color of a bruise that hadn't quite surfaced yet. Gerald came down the stairs, his movements sharp and efficient. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than my first 3 cars combined. He didn't look at me as he headed for the coffee pot. He looked at his phone. The movers are coming for a quote at 3. Simone, he called out, his voice echoing off the tile. Tell your mother to have the garage clear of her projects. I don't want them tripping over yarn and scrap wood. I didn't stop my stitching. I didn't even look up. The garage isn't just a storage unit, Gerald, I said, my voice steady as a heartbeat. It's a workshop. It's where things are built to last. He turned then, a smirk playing on his thin lips. Built to last? This isn't the 1950s. We live in a world of upgrades, Mama. If it's old and it's in the way, it goes. That's just progress. He walked over to where I sat, peering down at the crochet hook in my hand. That's a lot of work for a blanket no one's going to use. Why don't you let Simone take you to the mall? Buy something soft and machine washable. Save your eyes. My eyes see just fine, I replied, finally looking up. I let the silence stretch between us. Silence is a curious thing. Most people feel the need to fill it with lies or nervous laughter. Gerald just grew more impatient. I'm making this for you, Gerald. A gift for the new chapter you're so keen on starting. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Well, make it quick. We're moving fast. When he left, the front door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a gavel, I set my work down. I went to the kitchen and looked at the calendar on the fridge. He had circled a date 2 weeks from now. The big shift, it said in his bold, careless hand. I pulled a small, silver thumb drive from the pocket of my apron. I had found it taped to the underside of one of the ledgers in the clock. My husband was a meticulous man. He knew that in a world of upgrades, the digital footprint is often the one that trips you up. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I wasn't looking for bank accounts. Not yet. I was looking for the patterns. Gerald was a developer, or so he told Simone. But the files on this drive told a story of consultancy fees paid by a holding company that specialized in predatory land acquisitions. He wasn't just selling my house. He was selling the entire block. He was the fox in the henhouse, and he'd been given the keys by his own wife. Simone walked in then, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't see the laptop. I closed it before she crossed the threshold. Mama, she whispered, sitting across from me. Gerald says we have to move you. He says the taxes are going up, so we won't be able to keep the lights on by Christmas. Is that true? I reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was cold. Taxes are like the weather. Baby, they change. But the foundation stays. He says you're getting forgetful, she continued, her voice trembling. He says you left the stove on twice last week. I didn't see it, but he said. I felt a cold flicker of something sharp in my chest. So that was the play. The forgetful grandmother narrative. The easiest way to move an obstacle is to convince everyone it's broken. Do you think I'm forgetful, Simone? I asked, my gaze boring into hers. No, she said, but the word was hesitant. But he's so sure. He has it all written down in his planner. Dates. Times. A man who writes down lies is just a man afraid he'll forget the truth. I said softly. I squeezed her hand. Go lay down. I'll make some tea. And Simone, don't worry about the garage. I've already started clearing things out. As she retreated, I didn't make tea. I went back to my crochet. I began a new row. This one was different. I was using a technique my grandmother taught me, a double locking stitch. Once it's set, you can't pull the thread to unravel it. You have to cut it. Gerald thought he was the one moving the pieces. He thought he was the one restructuring our lives. But he failed to realize that while he was busy looking at the big picture, I was looking at the threads. And I had already found the one that, when pulled, would bring his entire world down around his ankles. I worked through the afternoon, the sun shifting across the floor. By the time the movers arrived for their quote, I was finished with the third panel. The mover, a burly man with kind eyes, looked at the grandfather clock in the garage. That's a beauty, he said. Heavy, though. Solid lead in the weights. Solid enough, I said, leaning against the workbench. It's been in the family a long time. It's very sensitive to movement. If you tilt it even an inch the wrong way, the whole mechanism locks up. I'll be careful, ma'am, he promised. I know you will, I said, but Gerald is the one you should watch. He's very eager to see it moved. Sometimes when people are in a hurry, they forget that some things aren't meant to be shifted. I walked back into the house, leaving him to his measurements. The trap wasn't just in the ledgers. It wasn't just in the digital files. It was in the very air Gerald breathed. He was so convinced of my frailty that he had become blind to my presence. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair. Gerald talked about the new condo, all glass and steel. He talked about streamlining our belongings. I've decided to donate those old quilts, he said, stabbing a piece of chicken. They won't fit the aesthetic. Too much clutter. I smiled. It was the first time I had smiled at him in weeks. It was a small, thin thing like the edge of a blade. I understand, Gerald, I said. Clutter can be so distracting, especially when you're trying to hide something. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said, reaching for the salt. Just an observation from an old woman. Would you like some more gravy? He went back to his meal, but I saw the slight tremor in his hand. He was starting to feel it. Not the threat, not yet, but the weight. The invisible pressure of being watched by someone you've already dismissed. The evening ended with him, retreating to his office, no doubt to check his planner of my supposed lapses in memory. I sat in my chair, the midnight blue quilt draped over my legs. The first movement had been made. The thread was looped. Now, I just had to wait for him to step into the center. Disrespect is a quiet thing at first. It's the way someone stops saying please, or how they start talking about you in the third person while you're standing right in front of them. Gerald had mastered that art. By Tuesday, I had become a piece of furniture in my own home, a sideboard or a heavy drapes, present but unconsidered. She's having one of her quiet days, Gerald said into his Bluetooth earpiece as he paced the hallway. He didn't even lower his voice. The doctor said it's common. Withdrawal followed by fixation. She's been staring at that blue blanket for 4 hours. Yeah, the paperwork is almost ready. Once we have the assessment, the house sale can move forward without any sentimental delays. I didn't blink. I was counting. 1, 2, slip the stitch. 1, 2, lock the loop. I wasn't staring at the blanket. I was listening to the frequency of his panic. Gerald was talking faster than he had last week. The bridge loan was likely coming due, and the consultancy fees from the holding company were drying up. He needed my house. not just for the equity, but to bury the trail of his own bad investments. When he finally left for his site visit, I folded the midnight blue quilt. It was heavy now, weighted with more than just yarn. I went into the kitchen and found Simone sitting at the table, staring at a stack of brochures for luxury assisted living. "They have a crochet club, Mama," she said, her voice small and hollow. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "And a garden. You always loved your roses." "I do love my roses," I said, pulling a chair out and sitting beside her. I didn't look at the brochures. But roses need deep roots to survive the wind. You transplant them at the wrong time, and they wither. Does Gerald know that? "He's just trying to help us, Mama. He says we're drowning in this house." "Is that what he says?" I reached out and turned one of the brochures over. On the back, in the margin, were numbers. Gerald's numbers. He had been calculating the commission he'd make on the referral. He wasn't just moving me, he was selling me. "Simone, I want you to go into the garage," I said softly. She looked up, startled. "The garage? Why?" Gerald said, "It's a mess. I want you to look at the crochet garments I made for your father. The ones in the cedar chest behind the clock. I want you to take them out and look at the linings." She frowned, confused, but she got up. I watched her through the window as she crossed the yard. I knew exactly what she would find. Inside the silk linings of those vests, I had stitched the original deeds to the property. The ones that showed the land had been placed in a private trust in her name 10 years ago. A trust Gerald couldn't touch. A trust he didn't even know existed because he never bothered to look at old things. While she was gone, I returned to my laptop. I had found the connection I needed. The holding company Gerald was working for was owned by a man he had cleared land for in the past. Illegally. It was a cycle of debt and favors. Gerald wasn't a partner. He was a fall man. I sent a single, anonymous email to the city's zoning board. It didn't contain an accusation. It simply contained a question about the bridge loan and the unrecorded easements on our block. I knew how the bureaucracy worked. Once a question is asked, the gears begin to grind. And once those gears grind, they don't stop for anyone's aesthetic. Simone came back into the house 20 minutes later. She was pale, clutching a piece of yellowed parchment in her hand. Her eyes were wide, and for the first time in months, they were clear. "Mama, this says the house is mine. It says Gerald has no authority to list it. Knowledge is a quiet power, Simone," I said, taking a sip of my tea. It was perfectly warm. "He told you we were drowning, so he could sell you a life jacket he stole from your own boat. He lied to me about everything." "He didn't lie," I corrected her gently. "He just assumed you wouldn't check the stitches. He assumed I was too old to remember where I hid the thread." I stood up and smoothed my apron. "Now, go put that back. Exactly where you found it. We aren't ready to show our hand yet. Gerald is a man of timing. He thinks the clock is stopping. We need him to believe that right up until the second it strikes 12. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. I looked toward the garage, where the grandfather clock stood, waiting in the shadows. "I'm going to finish my gift," I said, "and then I'm going to watch the gravity take hold." The evening was silent. Gerald returned late, smelling of expensive scotch and desperation. He didn't speak to us. He went straight to his office and locked the door. I sat in my chair, the silver hook flashing in the dim light. The tension was rising. I could feel it in the house, the way the floorboards groaned, the way the air felt thin. Gerald thought he was the architect of our future. He didn't realize that I was the one holding the structural supports. The air in the house had changed. It was no longer the scent of rosemary. It was the smell of a storm held behind a closed door. Gerald didn't eat breakfast with us anymore. He spent his mornings in the garage, pacing, his voice a jagged edge as he argued with people over the phone. I sat on the porch, my crochet hook moving with the steady, unbothered pace of a mountain stream. I don't care about the zoning inquiry. I heard him hiss from behind the garage door. The signatures are coming. Just hold the buyer. If this bridge loan collapses, we're all underwater. I adjusted the tension on my yarn. Underwater. It was a vivid image for a man who didn't know how to swim in deep secrets. I had spent the morning working on a set of crochet coasters, small, circular things in a neutral beige. They looked harmless. They looked like something a forgetful woman would make to pass the time. But beneath the beige wool, I had woven something Gerald wouldn't notice until it was too late. High-tensile fishing line, stitched in a pattern that made the centers nearly indestructible. Simone came out to the porch, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. She had learned quickly. She sat in the wicker chair beside me, picking up a half-finished quilt I'd started months ago. He's asking for the keys to the cedar chest. Mama, she whispered, her hands shaking as she pretended to inspect the stitching. He said he found a buyer for the vintage textiles inside. And what did you tell him, baby? I told him I lost them. I told him I think you might have misplaced them during one of your episodes. She swallowed hard. It felt like a sin to say it. A lie told to protect the truth is just a shield, Simone. Don't let it weigh on you. I looked toward the garage. Let him hunt. A man looking for a key usually forgets to look at the hinges. At noon, Gerald emerged. He looked frayed. His expensive silk tie was crooked, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool breeze. He walked toward us, his eyes scanning the porch. He didn't see two women. He saw two obstacles. Mama, he said, his voice forced and tight. I need to get into that chest in the garage. Now, it's for your own good. We need the liquidation funds for your deposit at the new facility. I stopped my hook. I looked him directly in the eye, my expression one of mild, vacant confusion. The chest? Oh, Gerald, I haven't seen those keys since your father passed. Are you sure you didn't move them when you were streamlining the office? He let out a sharp, frustrated breath. I haven't moved anything in the office. Just stay here. Don't go near the garage. I have people coming by to look at the structural supports. He turned and marched back inside. He was so focused on the chest, the obvious prize, that he completely ignored the grandfather clock sitting 3 feet away from it. He ignored the fact that the clock's pendulum was now swinging, a low, rhythmic thump-thump that matched the beating of a nervous heart. I had set the clock last night, not to the correct time, but to a specific interval. Every 60 minutes, it chimed a low, somber tone that vibrated through the floorboards. By 3 o'clock, the structural inspectors arrived. They weren't inspectors. I recognized one of them from the holding company files. They were there to verify the empty status of the house. Gerald led them into the garage, his voice booming with a false confidence that made my skin crawl. As you can see, the space is ready for conversion, Gerald said. The elderly occupant is already transitioned into the care planning phase. No legal encumbrances. I stood up, the midnight blue quilt over my arm, and walked toward the garage. Simone followed, a step behind me. Everything all right in here, Gerald? I asked, pushing the door open. The men turned. Gerald's face went a shade of gray I hadn't seen before. Mama, I told you to stay on the porch. We're busy. I just wanted to bring the gentlemen some tea, I said, holding out a tray with the beige coasters, and to show them the clock. It's a marvel of engineering. Really, my husband always said it was the heart of the house. One of the men, a sharp-faced individual in a charcoal suit, squinted at the clock. That wasn't on the inventory list, Gerald. It's junk, Gerald snapped. It's being hauled away tomorrow. Actually, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming as cool as the cellar air. It's the anchor. My husband tied the property trust to the maintenance of this specific piece. If it leaves the premises, the deed automatically reverts to a secondary beneficiary. Did Gerald not mention the maintenance clause in the filings? The silence that followed was absolute. The man in the charcoal suit looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and dawning realization. She's confused, Gerald hissed. She doesn't know what she's talking about. There is no trust. Check the hinges, Gerald, I said softly. I turned and walked back toward the house. I didn't need to stay to see the fallout. I knew that the man in the charcoal suit was a man of business, and business does not like unexpected legal anchors. As the sun began to set, I sat back in my chair. The garage door slammed, and a car sped away, tires screeching. Gerald didn't come into the house. He stayed in the driveway, a dark silhouette against the fading light. The thread had more than just frayed. It had begun to unspool, and Gerald was standing right in the path of the falling weight. The house had grown cold, not because of the weather, but because of the silence. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a glass pane shatters, a held breath that hurts the chest. Gerald hadn't spoken a word to me since the inspectors left. He paced the upstairs hallway until 3 a.m, his footsteps heavy and uneven, the sound of a man trying to outrun a shadow that was attached to his own heels. I sat in my usual chair as the sun crawled over the windowsill. I was working on a pair of crochet gloves, delicate, intricate things, in a pale, ghostly gray. My hands didn't shake. When you have lived 60 years, you realize that most of the things people scream about are just noise. The real power is in the whisper. Gerald came down the stairs. He hadn't shaved. His eyes were bloodshot, and his expensive shirt was wrinkled. He didn't go for the coffee. He walked straight to me and stood so close I could smell the stale scotch on his breath. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "You think that little stunt in the garage changed anything? The trust doesn't matter if you aren't around to testify to its intent, Mama. And Simone, she'll do what I tell her. She always does." I didn't look up from my stitches. Fear is a poor architect, Gerald. You're building a house on a foundation of threats. Eventually, the weight of the lies becomes greater than the strength of the walls. "I'm not building anything anymore," he hissed, leaning down until his face was inches from mine. "I'm clearing the lot. By Monday, this house is going to be condemned for structural instability. I've already made the calls. The city will move you out for your own safety. And once you're in that state-run ward, no one is going to listen to stories about grandfather clocks and secret ledgers." I finally looked at him. I didn't show anger. I showed him the one thing a man like him can't stand: pity. "You've forgotten the most important rule of the trade, Gerald," I said softly. "What's that?" "Always check the tension." He let out a sharp, ugly laugh and stormed out the back door toward the garage. I watched him go. He was moving toward the clock, his gait aggressive. He was going to destroy the evidence. He was going to break the anchor I had mentioned. Simone appeared in the doorway, her face pale. She had heard everything. "He's going to hurt the clock, Mama. He's going to break it." "Let him try," I said, my voice as calm as a deep well. "Go into the kitchen, Simone. Turn on the radio. Set it to that jazz station your father liked. Keep it loud enough that you don't have to listen to the sound of a man making a mistake. But go, baby. Trust the stitch." She did as I asked. The smooth, brassy notes of a saxophone filled the house. I stood up, draped the gray gloves over the arm of my chair, and walked toward the garage. I didn't rush. Through the small window of the garage door, I saw Gerald. He had a crowbar in his hand. He was standing in front of the grandfather clock, his chest heaving. He jammed the metal tip into the seam of the mahogany base, the very spot where I had shown him the hinge He didn't know that my husband, a man of infinite precision, had rigged that specific panel for a very different purpose. It wasn't a maintenance clause. It was a failsafe. As Gerald wrenched the bar with all his might, there was no sound of splintering wood. Instead, there was a sharp metallic ping. The base of the clock didn't open, but the heavy, leaden weights inside the casing, the ones the mover had noted were so solid, were released from their internal catch. They didn't fall to the floor. They dropped 6 inches onto a pressure plate hidden in the floor of the clock's cabinet. Suddenly, the garage lights flickered and died. The silent hum of the freezer in the corner cut out. Gerald froze. "What did you do?" he shouted, spinning around to face the door where I stood. "I didn't do anything, Gerald," I said, leaning against the frame. "The clock did. It's an old security system. When the base is tampered with, it cuts the main breaker to the garage and the home office. It also, if I recall correctly, sends a fault signal to the security company. They'll be calling the police to check on a potential break-in any minute now." "You old witch," he screamed, lunging toward me. I didn't move. I didn't have to. From the driveway, the sound of a car pulling up muffled the jazz music from the house. It wasn't the police. It was the man in the charcoal suit from yesterday. And he wasn't alone. He had 2 men with him, men who didn't look like they cared about zoning laws or luxury condos. Gerald stopped in his tracks, the crowbar still in his hand. "Gerald," the man in the suit said, stepping into the dim light of the garage. "We had a conversation about legal encumbrances. You told me the property was clear, but my lawyers just found a series of unrecorded easements and a trust registered in the name of a Simone Jenkins. You've been trying to sell us land you don't own using a bridge loan that's backed by a fraudulent deed." Gerald's face went from gray to a sickly white. "I can fix it. I just need more time." "Time is the one thing you've run out of," I said, stepping into the garage. I looked at the man in the suit. He's been very busy, hasn't he? Trying to move things that don't belong to him. The man in the suit nodded to me, a sign of respect from one predator to another. "He has. We're here to collect the consultancy fees he's already spent, and we'll be taking the ledgers he promised were in that chest." Gerald looked at the crowbar in his hand, then at the men. He was trapped between the law he'd broken and the people he'd swindled. "The ledgers aren't here," Gerald stammered. She hid them." "I didn't hide them, Gerald," I said, my voice a soothing melody. "I simply put them where they belong, in the hands of someone who knows how to read between the lines." The man in the suit stepped closer to Gerald. "Let's go for a drive, Gerald. We have a lot to discuss about restructuring your debt." As they led him out of the garage, Gerald looked back at me. His eyes were full of a frantic, wild terror. He finally understood. I hadn't been watching him with the eyes of a grandmother. I had been watching him with the eyes of a hunter who had already dug the pit. I walked over to the clock. I reached in and reset the weights with a practiced flick of my wrist. The power in the house hummed back to life. The jazz music swelled. "Everything has its timing. Gerald," I whispered to the empty garage. I walked back into the house and sat down. I picked up the gray gloves. The pattern was almost finished. The house felt lighter the next morning, as if a fever had finally broken. The heavy, oppressive energy Gerald carried with him had been replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. He hadn't returned. His SUV remained in the driveway, a sleek, black reminder of a man who thought he could outrun his own shadow. I sat at the kitchen table, the gray crochet gloves resting beside my coffee. I wasn't working today. I was waiting. Simone walked in, her movements slow and cautious. She looked like someone waking up from a long, confusing dream. She sat across from me and reached for the gloves, running her thumb over the intricate stitches. "They haven't called, Mama," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The police, the men from the garage, no one. The men Gerald invited into our lives don't call the police, Simone, I said. They handle their business in the dark. Gerald knew the rules of the game he was playing. He just didn't realize I knew them, too. What's going to happen to him? I looked out the window at the garden. The roses were beginning to bud. That depends on how much of their money he's already turned into minimalist furniture and silk ties. But that isn't our concern anymore. Our concern is the thread that's still attached to this house. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet. I pulled out a heavy cedar-scented quilt, the one I had made for my husband's 65th birthday. It was a masterpiece of geometry, full of hidden pockets and reinforced seams. Help me take this to the porch, I said. We spread the quilt over the railing. It was a signal. Within an hour, a car pulled up, a modest dented sedan. Out stepped a woman I hadn't seen in years, a former colleague of my husband's named Martha. She was an expert in forensic accounting, a woman who saw the world in columns of red and black. He left quite a mess, didn't he? Martha said, joining us on the porch. She didn't offer a hug. She offered a clipboard. He tried to rewrite the ledger, I said, but he forgot that the original ink never truly fades. We spent the afternoon in the sunroom. Simone watched in silence as we went through the files I had retrieved from the clock. Martha's eyes sharpened as she turned the pages. He didn't just take a bridge loan, Martha noted, tapping a finger on a specific line. He used your identity, Simone. He forged your signature on a power of attorney 3 months ago. That's how he was able to list the house. Simone gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I signed some papers for a tax rebate. He told me it was routine. It was routine for him, I said, my voice hardening. But he made a mistake. He used a fountain pen. My husband's fountain pen. The one with the unique nib that leaves a microscopic skip in the line. He didn't know that pen is registered to a trust, and every document signed with it is automatically flagged for review by the estate's lawyers. He was trying to erase me, Simone whispered, tears finally spilling over. He was trying to erase us both, I said, taking her hand. But you can't erase a pattern once the knots are tied. You can only try to hide it, and Gerald was never very good at hiding things from me. As Martha packed her things, she looked at me with a knowing smile. The city will be here tomorrow to discuss those unrecorded easements you reported. With these forged documents, the zoning inquiry will turn into a criminal investigation. Gerald won't be coming back for his SUV or his treadmill. Thank you, Martha, I said. When she left, the evening air turned cool. I picked up my crochet hook again. I began chapter 6 of the Midnight Blue Quilt. I was adding a border of gold thread, thin, metallic, and sharp. The social tension that had gripped this house for months was snapping. The power dynamics had shifted so completely that Gerald's name was no longer spoken. He had become a ghost before he was even gone. Mama? Simone asked, watching me work. Why gold? Because, I said, the hook clicking rhythmically. Every story needs a clear ending, and gold is the color of a debt that has been settled in full. I looked toward the garage. The clock was still ticking, a steady, inevitable sound. Gerald thought he was the architect of a new future. He didn't realize that I was the one who had already finished the blueprint for his past. The thread was tightening. The knot was almost complete. The morning brought a stillness so profound it felt like the world had been tucked into a cedar chest. The movers Gerald had hired never showed up. The phone didn't ring with his aggressive demands. Instead, the only sound was the low, steady click of my hook and the rhythmic heartbeat of the grandfather clock in the garage. I was working on the penultimate section of the quilt. It was a complex pattern of interlocking squares, a design that looks chaotic up close, but reveals a perfect, unbreakable symmetry when you step back. That was the problem with Gerald. He was always too close to his own greed to see the symmetry of his own destruction. Simone spent the morning in the sunroom sorting through the donations Gerald had piled by the back door. She was moving with a new kind of purpose. Every time she found one of my crochet pieces or a hand-stitched quilt he had tossed aside, she smoothed it out with a tenderness that made my throat tight. "He was going to throw these away, Mama," she said, holding up a small, white baby blanket I'd made for her 25 years ago. "He told me they were dust collectors." "Dust is just time that's settled, baby," I said, "and some things are worth collecting." Around noon, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. It wasn't the men from the holding company, and it wasn't the police. It was a man in a soft gray suit, a lawyer from the trust my husband had established. He carried a leather briefcase and a look of professional regret. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, stepping onto the porch. "I received the files from Martha. I've also received a notification from the bank regarding an attempted transfer of funds from the property trust. A transfer that failed." "Of course it failed," I said, setting my work in my lap. "The trust requires a biometric signature, the thumbprint of the primary beneficiary. Gerald has many talents, but he couldn't forge a living pulse." The lawyer sat in the wicker chair Gerald used to claim as his own. "He's in significant trouble. The holding company he was consulting for is under federal investigation for racketeering. They aren't happy that Gerald used their bridge loan to cover personal gambling debts instead of securing the easements he promised." "Gambling," Simone whispered from the doorway. "He told me it was high-stakes investment. It's the same thing when you're using someone else's money," the lawyer replied. He turned back to me. "The authorities are looking for him, but the men he owes money to will likely find him first. He's been seen at a motel near the county line, trying to sell his watch. And that SUV..." I looked down at the gold thread in my quilt, the gold-plated watch. It's funny. He thought it made him look like a man of substance. He didn't realize that in this house, we value things that are solid all the way through. "What happens now?" Simone asked. "Now," the lawyer said, standing up, "we file the protective orders. We freeze the remaining assets he tried to hide in your name, and we wait for the pendulum to finish its swing." When he left, the house felt even larger. The space Gerald had occupied with his noise and his ego was now empty, and it was a beautiful, clean emptiness. I went to the kitchen and began to prepare a meal. Not the rushed, nervous dinners we had when Gerald was here, but a slow-cooked stew, the kind that fills every corner of the house with warmth. I chopped the vegetables with a sharp, heavy knife, my movements precise. I thought about Gerald sitting in that motel room, staring at a watch that wouldn't tell him how to get his life back. He had spent so much time trying to clean this house of its history, but he had only succeeded in scrubbing himself right out of the picture. I went back to my chair as the stew simmered. I had reached the final corner of the 7th chapter. The tension was perfect, not too tight to pucker, not too loose to fray. It was the tension of a life lived with observation. "Mama," Simone said, sitting at my feet. "How did you know? How did you know about the gambling, the forgeries, all of it?" "I didn't have to know the details, Simone," I said, my voice low and resonant. "I just had to watch the way he handled the thread. When a man is lying, his rhythm changes. He moves too fast. He skips the small stitches because he's so focused on the finish line. And when you skip the small stitches, the whole thing eventually falls apart." I pulled the last loop through for the day. The sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the floorboards. The garage was dark now, but I knew the clock was still there, guarding the ledgers and the truth. Gerald thought he was the one with the power because he had the loudest voice. He didn't realize that the person who sits in the corner and listens is the one who eventually decides when the music stops. Tomorrow would be the final chapter. The revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be a confrontation. It would be a quiet, inevitable settling of the score. A weight finally finding the floor. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the silence. It was an intelligent silence, a strategic one. The end did not come with a scream. It came with the soft, metallic click of a suitcase latch. I was sitting on the porch when the taxi pulled into the driveway. It wasn't Gerald. It was a courier. He handed me a single, legal-sized envelope and a small velvet-lined box. No words were exchanged. He simply tipped his cap and drove away. I opened the box first. Inside was Gerald's gold-plated watch. The strap was broken, and the glass face was cracked right down the center, a jagged lightning bolt through the afternoon. He had sent it back, perhaps as a plea, or perhaps as a final, pathetic admission that his time had officially run out. I set the broken watch on the side table and opened the envelope. It contained the signed, notarized quitclaim deeds and a full confession of the forgeries. He had traded his silence and his exit for a chance to disappear before the men in the black sedan or the federal agents found him. He was gone, scrubbed from our lives by the very streamlining he had once championed. I walked into the garage one last time. The grandfather clock was silent now. I had stopped the pendulum at exactly noon. I reached into the hidden drawer and pulled out the midnight blue quilt. It was finished. Every knot was secure. Every gold thread glinted like a promise kept. Simone joined me, her face glowing with a peace I hadn't seen in years. "It's over, isn't it, Mama?" "It's not just over, baby," I said, draping the quilt over the clock. "It's settled. The house is yours. The trust is intact, and the trash has been collected." I looked at the mahogany casing. My husband had always said that justice isn't about the noise you make. It's about the silence you leave behind. Gerald had tried to build a kingdom on air, forgetting that gravity always wins. He underestimated a woman who had spent 60 years learning that the strongest things in the world are often the ones you can't see, like love, like memory, and like a well-placed thread. I walked back into the house and closed the door. The garage was just a garage again. The house was a home. And the weight that had been pressing down on us for so long, it had finally found its level. I sat in my chair and picked up my crochet hook. I wasn't making a trap anymore. I was just making a scarf for Simone. Something soft, something warm, something built to last. The world thinks we grow fragile as we age. They think our eyes fail and our minds wander, but they don't realize that the older we get, the more we see. We see the patterns before they form. We feel the tension before the snap, and we know exactly how to wait for the moment when the pendulum finally swings back home. Gerald thought he was the one with the plan. He just didn't realize he was part of mine. The quietest victories are often the most absolute. Gerald's watch stopped, but our story is just beginning. If you've ever been underestimated and want to see more stories where wisdom outplays arrogance, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Like this video to stand with the women who know how to wait, and comment "settled" if you saw the ending coming. Share this with someone who needs to remember that a slow burn always leaves the deepest mark. Thank you for watching Old School Payback.